Lately, I've been pretty fascinated by memetics and fascinated by extreme value theory. I want to read everything by Taleb, Rene Girard, and Didier Sornette, I think is how you say his name. This is a big topic, and they approach this from completely different angles. For example, if you read something by Sornette, then he will tackle it from an extremely mathematical point of view, extremely advanced mathematics, calculus. Whereas if you read something like Girard, he will tackle it from an extremely obtuse philosophical perspective. Although Girard is more clearly mimetics. It's kind of unclear what mimetics is. I'm not going to be explaining the whole topic. I'm just going to be introducing it to a point. I'm just going to introduce it up to a point where you perhaps know what it is, and I'm going to be sharing some things about it that I personally find interesting. If this is the type of topic that you find interesting, I would definitely start with Taleb, although I'm not even sure that he would describe his own work as being related to mimetics, but it's the most approachable yet comprehensive must-read body of work. When I first learned about mimetics, I felt like I couldn't believe that I had never heard about this, because the fact is this topic is almost unheard of. It's practically invisible to most people and most institutions. The people in power do not understand this, and it seems to explain everything. Yet the fact that people don't understand it, it makes them weak. It makes them both weak and dangerous, but at the same time, it makes them vulnerable, able to be exploited through the tools of mimetics. So I'm hyping it up all this much. What the heck is this? Well, mimetic, the root word is meme. Meme as in mime, mime is as in copy. Mimetics is closely related to the concept of imitation, but the fact that we don't use the word imitation is to encapsulate the fact that mimetics is much broader than imitation. Imitation has certain connotations. Here's an example. If you think about it, all life is a form of copying, because if a mother and father get together and have a child, that child is, to some extent, a duplicate of the mother and the father, but not exactly like either. But nevertheless, the purpose of life is to self-replicate, to duplicate itself. Because fundamentally, what a life form is just a pattern that has the ability to duplicate itself through reproduction and to make gradual changes to itself over time. And this is where we get the word meme, coined by Richard Dawkins and other people that Taleb hates, of course. Meme as in a cultural concept that evolves over time and duplicates itself, but when it duplicates itself, it makes slight changes, or its user makes slight changes to it, and the successful changes are able to duplicate themselves more, and its success is based on this. So there's a whole aspect of cultural evolution and how cultural evolutions can evolve with tradition that I'm not even sufficiently touching on here. What I want to touch on here more is the concept of madness of crowds versus wisdom of crowds. So you might have heard of the term wisdom of crowds. This is essentially saying that while each individual person might be foolish and wrong in all these ways, if you put them together, then the aggregate of all the people's thoughts can be wise. I'm going to talk about why this is wrong in a second, but the logic of it is that each person might be wrong, but the thing is they're all wrong in different ways. One person might be wrong to the left, the other person might be wrong to the right, and so if you put them all together, it averages out to the overall right opinion. So if you wanted to conduct an experiment of this, you would do one of those tests, you know, where you put a bunch of jelly beans in a jar and ask people to guess how many jelly beans there are in the jar. What you could do is put the jar in a room, and one by one you invite a bunch of people into the room. One by one these people come in, they guess how many jelly beans there are in the jar, you write down the number, and at the end you average together all these numbers. And even though some of the guesses might be wildly off, the overall average might be totally correct. Now let's talk about why this is wrong. But first I need to talk about the bell curve more generally, and what causes the bell curve distribution. Now Taleb is someone who avidly hates the bell curve. Now most people might say, well, the bell curve is a concept in statistics. It's okay, it just gets used incorrectly a lot of times. But Taleb would say, no, the bell curve itself is just crap. And he would say, okay, yes, maybe it could be used in these very narrow contexts with arbitrary rules that you just impose, but not in real world context. In real world context, it is not the most useful thing. But how do you derive the bell curve? Well, let's say you flip a coin and you write down the outcome of the coin toss, heads or tails, and you flip the coin 500 times. And then you graph out the likelihoods of each number of heads, number of tails. So if you flip the coin 500 times, then how many times do you flip 250 heads? How many times do you flip 200 heads? So you need to conduct this experiment over and over and over again. So you do the experiment of conducting 500 coin flips, and you do this 500 times. That's a lot of coin flips. But at the end, you can get a nice graphing out of the probabilities of each outcome that you could get when you flip the coin 500 times. And the most common thing will be the average, the 250 heads, 250 tails, but then sometimes you'll get more heads, more tails, but then as you get to the extremes, it drops off quickly, and that's a bell curve shape. And the fact that it drops off is really just a reflection of the fact that when you flip a coin 500 times, there are more combinations of ways that you could flip a more or less even number of heads and tails versus flipping heads every single time. There are not many ways that that could happen, so it's not very likely. So what really produces this bell curve shape is when you have independent observations, as in each coin flip does not interfere with the coin flip before it and the coin flip after it. It doesn't care what you did before, it doesn't care what you're going to do. It's not path dependent. And another example of this, you could say, the genes that control height. Now, in the human body, in the human genome, there are some genes which make you taller and some genes which make you shorter. And then when you inherit genes from your parents, then you get half of your genes from your mother and half of your genes from your father. And so depending on the heights of your mother and father, your height might be closer to your mother, your height might be closer to your father, just depending on the mix of genes that you happen to get. But if we take a very naive, very simplistic view of genetics, and just assume that for each gene you toss a coin and you have a 50-50 chance of getting it, then the result will be that it will be like a bell curve shape. But some people will be slightly taller, like the taller parent, and some people will be slightly shorter, like the shorter parent. But at the extremes of human height, you don't get a lot of people. You don't get people who are crazy, monstrously giant. You might get some people who are 1 or 2 feet taller than the average human, but you will never find someone who's like 10x taller than the average human. Now, if you're clever, you might be starting to spot a problem already. This model assumes that each input only occurs in isolation, which might be true in very limited circumstances. It might be true to assume that the inputs do not interfere with each other. But what happens when the inputs do interfere with each other? Let's say that person 1 copies person 2, and person 2 copies person 3, and person 3 copies person 4. Well, now, the input, the measurement that you got of person 4, you can account for the fact that it left an impression on person 1. You won't necessarily get a normal distribution, because each action is not happening in isolation. And for this reason, the wisdom of crowds can actually turn into the madness of crowds. The wisdom of crowds model, it was based on the idea that you get one person at a time, put them in a room, and have them make an independent guess, unmotivated by anyone else. But in reality, people will respond to each other. One wrong guess early on can spark a chain reaction of wrong guesses, as people all copy each other. So a more realistic modeling of human behavior can be something like the stock market. If one person sells a share, that can spark other people to sell shares, but that's just scratching the surface. In the economy, there's an extremely complicated web of transactions that happens, where one thing can spark a butterfly effect that leads to bubbles and economic disasters. I hope you made it this far into the video, because so far I've been talking pretty unenthusiastically about kind of boring technical topics, economics, probability. I'm a bit exasperated from having to re-record things that went bad, but you have to understand just how monumental all of this is. This is one of the most important yet neglected topics in the world. It matters a huge amount. It matters in the sense that a lot of enormous failures, both past, present, and future, can be chalked up to people just not getting this topic. But it also matters in the sense that it represents a huge opportunity for you. Not in like a business pitch type of way, but just in a general way that you can integrate it into your whole philosophy of how you understand things. What I want to do is remind you of a particular word, a particular term that's used and employed in a lot of situations, and that term is virality. We say this of a lot of things, not just diseases, but videos, all sorts of phenomenon. We say they are viral, they're viral phenomenon. We say that something has a lot of virality. And virality is something related to growth. It means that you have a certain momentum where if you just got a bunch of users, you're probably going to get a bunch of more users. But that's not all it is, and that's not the true depth of it. The depth of it relates to this, the exponential curve. Now, as for the exponential curve, I think it's really the sort of thing where you either know how massively significant it is, or you don't. You're just, oh, that's something, it's part of math. Yeah, it's important sometimes. But what I want to impress on you is the difference between what is linear and what's exponential. The fact is that the human mind is just not capable of understanding truly huge numbers. And this insight goes back to ancient times. This is the old parable about the chessboard. You start with 1 grain of rice on the first square, 2 on the second square, 4 on the third square, for all the squares of the chessboard, and then the guy asks the king, okay, can you pay me this amount for the good deed I have done? And the king says, oh, that doesn't sound like much, because an individual grain of rice doesn't seem that big, so even if you get a lot of them, how much can it really be? But that's thinking in linear terms, right? Of course, the actual outcome is some ridiculous number, probably more grains of sand than exist in the world, because you're multiplying a power of 2 by a large enough number. But people employ the same fallacious thinking when they say, oh, the stock isn't going to go down by that much because it hasn't gone down by that much in the past, and the most it's ever gone down is X amount, so even worst case, it's going to go down 2X. Isn't that bad? And they calculate risk in this way. If you want to multiply something by 1.2x, or 1.4x, or maybe 1.8x, then use linear curves. But if you want to multiply something by 100x, then you're probably going to see somewhere that there is an exponential curve. And that's what's important about it, because remember when I said that you could benefit from this knowledge? Well, this is how. You want to be on the upside of the exponential curve. And to understand how you can do that, I would recommend Peter Thiel's book 0 to 1. A wise man once said that compound interest was the most powerful force in the universe. I'm inclined to agree, but it sure as hell goes beyond interest. There are 2 ways of explaining how you can get the upside of that. The first way is to get leverage, and the second is to get into something that scales. To get into something that scales just means certain industries have the propensity to, multiply you 100x. Now, it's also the case that a lot of these industries have enormous risk. A lot of people don't get any benefit at all, so you need to take into account the downside and the upside, obviously. The next thing you can do is to have leverage. Now, what is leverage? Well, why do you think a CEO makes so much? Well, CEOs probably work pretty hard. They probably work a lot harder than just the average worker. Well, even if a CEO is 10 times more productive than the average worker, well, they don't get paid 10 times as much. They get paid like 100 times as much. Well, is it really the case that they deserve that much money? What's going on? Well, I think it might be the case that they're creating that much value, but to no competence of their own. It's the fact that they control so much leverage. That is, every beneficial decision that they make, any 10% improvement in productivity that they make, it is multiplied across all of the employees of the company. However many employees there are in the company and employees, the good decisions that they make are multiplied by N. So employees are one kind of leverage. There are other kinds of leverage as well. But I'm going to change gears now. This brings us to the ultimate thinker in the field of mimetics, Rene Girard, who has an extremely extensive library of obtuse philosophical works where he analyzes mimetic theory. Now, I myself am not that deep into his works, but I'm just giving a brief introduction on all of these topics. But as for Girard, he's particularly interested in anthropology, in studying what he calls primitive societies and how they respond to mimicry. And according to him, primitive societies have a huge array of prohibitions against mimetic behavior. They are very sensitive to what is mimetic behavior and how to prevent it. Because the logic goes that the reason we desire anything is because we see other people desiring it. We see other people desiring something, and then we want to desire that thing. I would not go so far as to agree with this. I would think that to the degree that power derives from status, that is probably the case. But this creates a problem, and the problem is of rivalry. If 2 people want the same thing, and the good is scarce, then that's a competitive dynamic. two people fighting for the same thing. We don't think of it as that much of a problem in modern societies because we have economies that can just chug out goods. But in primitive societies, where a whole bunch of things are just inherently scarce, they are very sensitive to these dynamics. And because that's the roots that we come from, we still have residual distaste and sensitivity to it for the reasons of avoiding rivalry. So primitive societies have a whole bunch of weird prohibitions against mimetic behavior, to the point of some weird superstitions like avoiding mirrors because mirrors show your reflection. So that's a form of mimicry, even though to our ears it just sounds completely useless. But paradoxically, these societies also have complicated rituals where they indulge in mimicry. And the point of these rituals too is to avoid violence. In the same way you could avoid the rain by swimming in the river. By indulging in mimetics intentionally, they can distract from the original source of the conflict. And one idea that's really central to Girard's understanding of mimetics is the concept of the scapegoat. Because if we desire things ultimately because other people desire them, then it's a feedback loop that we can never break out of. I desire something and then someone else desires something because I do, and someone else desires something because that second person does. So you just create a chain of desires, and all along the way, rivalry increases and increases to the point where violence is hard to contain. But you can escape from this framework through what Girard describes as the scapegoat, where you pin the blame for the rivalry on one particular person, and then you excommunicate that person. I should note that Girard is also a Christian, and he says that Christianity is unlike every other religion because Christianity is the only religion where the scapegoat was actually innocent. Now, I wouldn't blame you if you said that a lot of the ideas that I've talked about so far seem kind of scattershot, not really connected to one another. But if you have an open mind and dig deep enough into this stuff, then extreme value theory is very much connected to mimetics. And if you want more information about that, the person who does the absolute best job of bridging together all of the ideas I have discussed here is Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel has influenced my thinking in a lot of profound ways, so I would strongly encourage you to check out pretty much everything he's ever said.